It's time for the Russ Belville Show's Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and a leading author and researcher on cannabinoids and health, who pins the Ask Dr. Mitch column for High Times magazine. Get your questions ready in our live chat or call in to 971-533-7111 now.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Half past the hour, time for our weekly visit with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. How you doing, Dr. Mitch?
Having a great day. How about you?
Oh, pretty good. We're getting our last warm weekend. We had our last warm weekend of the year, and now we're just battening down the hatches for 8 months of rain.
I'm afraid I turned on the heat this weekend myself, so we're just going to have to do our best.
All right. Well, Dr. Mitch, of course, is a renowned researcher on marijuana and its culture, science, history, and health. If you've got any questions, please get them into our chat room, or you can dial live at 971-533-7111. We've also got an email question, but before we get to all that, we always like to give Dr. Mitch the first word to tell us what's the latest in cannabis science.
Well, so far it's been kind of weird, but there's some new estimates out for basically every single state on how much money they might be able to earn if they had a tax and regulate system. And right now, New York State is over $100 million on that estimate, and California actually seems to have the highest with closing in on $500 million. So I think it's a pretty informative and interesting set of estimates and based on some pretty reasonable assumptions. So obviously there's a lot of money out there that could be made if we could just end this prohibition.
Excellent news. We reported on that as well. And any reaction from the folks in Albany?
It's curious because my more suspicious folks think there's been a whole lot of work behind the scenes on this already, but I don't see anything on the forefront other than one proposal by a state representative who I've met with before, and she's a wonderful person, and I'm certainly hoping she can get that out of committee.
All right. Well, let's go to some of the stories that I've got saved up here from the past week. We talked to you last Monday, and the very next day, interesting study came up, which I'm sure the result will shock you. Marijuana smokers may use the drug to cope with negative emotions.
Wow, there's a stunner. Yes, I know. It's interesting because I think folks are trying to frame this as negatively as possible, and I do want to, emphasize that we should all have a full range of affect and feel our feelings and stuff like that. There's a subset of folks who have a problem regulating their own emotions, and that emotion dysregulation, especially early in life and adolescence and stuff, seems to predict problematic use. And I of course, don't care about anybody's use. But when you start running into problems with it, that seems to be the issue. And I would just encourage folks to let themselves have a full range of feelings regardless of the plant. And if you feel bad, by all means, just let it run its course. And you'll be surprised how emotions come and go. Basically, moods are like the weather. They'll change sooner or later.
Yeah, that the report to me got me thinking of what I always say about teen marijuana use. And it's not so much that the marijuana use itself is so harmful. It's that you may be distracting yourself from dealing with a positive or negative emotion in your life that as a teenager, this is your first run. This is where you build, your perceptions and you build your habits on how to deal with situations in your life. And God knows you got enough, hormones running around in your brain from puberty as it is. You really don't need to be adding anything to that is going to mess you up for, trying to feel these experiences for the first time. I think that's what's so important.
It's funny because that avoidance coping style need not be from marijuana. I see folks do it with television or with alcohol or with all kinds of other activities. And the truth is, I think if we would quit catastrophizing about sadness and just feel it, we'd do a whole lot better.
Or video games and handheld devices, I would think too, would be something for this generation.
True.
All right, so escapism, like anything, moderation in all things, I suppose. All right, let's get to this other study, and this is the one, not so much the study that blew my mind, but the way that the mainstream media reported it and framed it. Mashable came up with this poll that supposedly said, and this is their headline, nearly 10% of Americans go to work high on weed. Did you get to see that study?
And boy, it made it sound like they were going to work high on weed every single day.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the problem I had with it.
First of all, not exactly the most random sampling technique. And then if you said you'd ever gone to work high at all, even one time, that was counted as a yes. So I'm afraid the coverage tend to make it sound like everybody was high at work all the time, or 10% of the people were high at work every single minute. And that was not what the data were really saying.
Yeah, and the other thing that I found that was interesting in that study is they asked people their prescription medication habits, and they had reported, some 13% or so that had reported, or I'm sorry, it's 28% that had reported they'd gone to work under the effects of a prescription medication. 13 to 15% who'd say they'd do it again or they'd do it at work. Now, I suppose that's not all mind-altering prescription medications, but still, doesn't that say something about how people tend to think of pills are okay, but God forbid anyone came in after they smoked a joint last weekend?
Oh, no, that's medicine. That doesn't count.
I guess you're right.
I mean, what are you supposed to say? If you're coming in all on Vicodin or even a couple of Benadryl, you're going to be a disaster. So I think the thing that should really matter is, are you doing a good job at work or not? Not what is essentially in your system.
Yeah. All right. And also a follow-up to that report. The website Mashable is the one that came up with this, and they had a report a month prior that pointed out that over 50% of Americans had gone to work under a hangover, which, alcohol overdose.
Well, and what's funny is we've got evidence for especially more sensitive works being basically impaired with hangover more than with actual measures of intoxication based on cannabis. So those old just savage fly the airplane simulator data that everybody always makes a big deal out of actually only had 12 people. But when those guys were hungover, they did worse than when they were actually smoking marijuana. So that's a rough thought.
All right. We've got a question here for Dr. Mitch from our listeners sent to me by email. And it goes this way. I gave up smoking cannabis in favor of my own alcohol tinctures about 6 years ago because smoking bothered my throat and lungs. Vaporizing was better, but not good enough. He uses a decarboxylated cannabis mixture with Everclear alcohol. And then his question is this: is there any data to indicate the long-term use of an alcohol tincture like that could harm the throat, either from the alcohol or from the cannabis liquid itself?
Well, so it's extremely unlikely that a cannabis would. If you wanted to switch to a food-based glycerin, that would sidestep some of the issues with alcohol. But odds are high if you're making it in concentrated enough. You're drinking maybe a teaspoon, I mean, it's really not a lot of exposure to the alcohol, so it seems really unlikely that it would be an issue.
Okay. Yeah, and reading the recipe here, an ounce of decarboxylated cannabis into 8 ounces of Everclear, mixture in a water bath for an hour, reduce the liquid to 4 ounces, and then 1 dropper in a shot glass topped up with water to dilute it. So yeah, it sounds very, very dilute to me. I don't think this would be something to worry about too much.
Exactly. I mean, if it's literally a dropper of alcohol, that's not going to get to anybody.
All right. So other stories in the news here. We just got the Sunday opinion piece. We're going to go off on this a little bit in hour 2, but 2 redheaded strangers, Maureen Dowd, the New York Times columnist who had overdosed on edibles in Colorado, got to meet up with Willie Nelson on the tour bus, the Honeysuckle Rose. Willie, of course, is a longtime board member for the advisory board of NORML, and I was just wondering if you saw that and saw any of Willie's advice about using edibles.
Well, and in fact, it's been making the rounds. Both celeb stoner folks, Chris Goldstein, who used to host this show, has mentioned it. And I feel like, what a surprise, Willie's used cannabis long enough to know what to do in order to minimize negative consequences. But it's really a question of paying attention to dosage, knowing your dosage when you start, and understanding that a little dab will do you.
Yeah, keep it simple, folks, and especially this. We've got a new campaign in Colorado, the Consume Responsibly campaign, that tries to make the point of start low, go slow, which is the theme that they've got of it. Start low, go slow, and they're saying start at 5 milligram doses and see where things go from there. But this has been something I've experienced with edibles. I remember a NORML event. I think was it the 2011 conference where a couple cookies in and they just found me slumped in a corner, pretty much useless to anybody. So it's something that even the professionals can have a problem with. Personally, I just don't do edibles in public anymore.
I got to admit, I think they're best for right before bed when you're planning on getting a good night's sleep, and that's about it.
All right. I want to remind folks that you can get a hold of Dr. Mitch Earlywine directly. If you prefer to keep things private, you can get into the email at 420research@gmail.com, 420research@gmail.com. There is another story I wanted to see your comment on. KPRC Houston reported on a significant increase of homeless people arriving from Texas to Colorado. And the head of one of the homeless shelters saying one of the big reasons is the homeless people wanting to smoke pot. Now, I've seen the prices of weed in Colorado. I don't think that's a very likely explanation, but what could you say about that particular story?
The rationale was supposed to be, they tend to get busted for cannabis possession when they're homeless in one state, and they'd be less likely to have that happen in another state. I could imagine somebody might have thought that as they were, hitchhiking their way into Colorado, but I'm afraid as soon as they realized they were going to have to work for hours and hours just to bum enough money for a gram, they may have been sorely disappointed.
Yeah, and I can't see the motivation of someone without a place to sleep wanting to leave, fairly warm, temperate Texas and make their way to Colorado as we're approaching winter. It didn't make a lot of sense to me, for sure. Oh, my goodness.
It's sad that this is how it gets framed, and there has been an increase in population in Colorado across all socioeconomic levels. So I think if they had compared it to, say, super wealthy people who moved there, that might have been a little more informative as far as the statistics were concerned.
All right. Well, Dr. Mitch Earlywine joins us on every Monday at 5:30 to discuss the Cannabis Q&A. And if you want to get your question asked, you can send it in by email, like we said, to 420research@gmail.com. As we're looking toward election season, Dr. Mitch, any thoughts on the ballot measures that are approaching in the 3 states and Washington, D.C.?
The key here is just going to be voter turnout. So everybody who's listening, make sure you take a friend to the polls with you, and then the two of you go grab another friend and make sure that person votes too. Because I know we can win if we can just